Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here at the Strand. We are so happy to have everyone here. Before we launch into a discussion of Tara's new book, Strange Rites, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from an original 48 stores until after over 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor and now run by third generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of authors, book lovers, and friends, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight, we are excited to have with us Tara Isabella Burton, who is celebrating the release of her new book, Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. Tara is a contributing editor at the American Interest, a columnist at Religion News Service, and the former staff religion reporter at Vox.com. She has written on religion and secularism for National Geographic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and more, and holds a doctorate in theology from Oxford. She's also the author of the novel, Social Creature. Joining Tara to discuss her new book is Ross Douthat. Ross is a columnist for the New York Times op-ed page. He is the author of To Change the Church, Bad Religion, and Privilege, and co-author of Grand New Party. Before joining the New York Times, he was a senior editor for The Atlantic. He is the film critic for National Review, and he co-hosts the New York Times weekly op-ed podcast, The Argument. He lives in New Haven with his wife and 3 children. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Tara and Ross.
Thank you so much, Sabir. Thanks to all of you for joining us here in this exciting virtual experience, this slightly disembodied way of talking about a book that's maybe appropriate to the subject matter. And Tara, thanks for letting me interrogate you about the future of religion in the United States and beyond.
Typical Thursday night. No, thank you so much for being here.
Just another Thursday night in America. So I just want to make 2 comments before we start. The first is that in our era of COVID, I've now done enough Zoom events to know that sometimes people are more hesitant to ask questions at when they're typing in questions than they would be at a real event when you can, stand up and tell the author why she's wrong about everything in the world. Don't be hesitant, because otherwise you'll just have to listen to me ask questions for the entire hour, and hopefully we'll get about 15 or 20 minutes of your questions in at the end. So that's the first point. The second one, which is one I'll reiterate at the end, is that this is a challenging time for everybody, and authors are obviously among the least challenged in many ways, but putting out a book at a moment like this is a difficult thing. I had a book come out and I was lucky enough to squeeze in a couple weeks of promotion before all the bookstores closed. But I just want to encourage you, if you're listening, watching, enjoying this, don't just buy the book. Don't just buy the book from the Strand, obviously. Encourage your friends to buy the book and, make it the bestseller that it deserves to be. So without further ado, let's start in with a big, dumb question. This is a book about new religions for a godless world, right? That's the subtitle. So is our world really godless? And if not, or if so, what religions are filling that void?
Spoiler alert. No, we don't live in a godless world. That's roughly the argument I make. So I want to draw a distinction, sort of when we talk about a secular age, as we are often wont to do, or a world without religion. What are we really talking about? And just a couple of sort of background statistics. About 23-24% of Americans say they're religiously unaffiliated, what's also often referred to as the religious NONES, nuns. About 36% of people born in America after 1985 identify as religious nuns, so a huge increase. But of these nuns, these unaffiliated, 72% say they believe in some sort of a higher power. And 20% actually say they believe in the God of the Bible, as I believe the polling puts the term. So we're not necessarily talking about people who are atheists, although about 6% of the population, although it's true that atheists tend to under-self-report. But we are talking about people who, for whatever reason, are alienated by institutional religion, organized religion, who feel that it has nothing to offer them, who may, as in the case of the people who believe in the traditional Judeo-Christian God, actually still have some form of faith, but who are unwilling to identify with, participate in it as a religion in and of itself. So we're talking about the spiritual, but not religious, but we're also talking about a broader category. And in my book, I call it the religiously remixed, which includes not just the spiritual, but not religious, which I think is the most sort of visible version of this phenomenon, but also people who do identify, tick the box, as it were, with a particular religious tradition, but whose personal practices, belief systems are more eclectic. And a statistic that I like to bring up here to give a sense of how widespread this is that about 30% of self-identified Christians say they believe in reincarnation, which is not, shall we say, something one would associate with Christian orthodoxy. So we are living in an age, I'd argue, where religious life, the components of a religious life, meaning, purpose, community, ritual, we're relating to them in a different way. We're mixing and matching. We're unbundling, to use a term that Harvard Divinity scholars Casper ter Kuile and Angie Thurston use in their work. And there's a sense in which we are all, sort of the end point of this is we are all making our own religions culturally. These can include not just elements of the traditional religions, but things like wellness culture, fandom, political activism, the sort of vast array of modern occultism, witchcraft, and neo-paganism and Wicca are among the fastest growing religions in America, and so on and so forth.
So I think one sort of initial response to a description of your thesis that someone well-versed in American history might have is, how new is all this, right? Because after all, there is in certain ways nothing more American than being entrepreneurial and sort of setting up a church of one. This is sort of, every kid in high school English class, at least back when I went to high school, was assigned the collected works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and you get a certain kind of individualized religion there. And then, the larger history of 19th century American spirituality is rife with what you in the book call sort of intuitional religion. So can you talk a little bit about what is the same and what is different? Like what do we have in common with 19th century America, and what's changed in the last 30 or 40 years?
Sure. So what I call intuitionalism in the book, a sort of catch-all term for religious practices and beliefs that sort of focus inwards on the gut, the individual, the feelings, versus institutionalism. Again, these are kind of reductive terms, but your church, your dogma, your external forces. We've seen quite a history of the pendulum swinging back and forth in American religious life, and these sort of outcroppings of intuitional faith, intuitional approaches to faith, the various great awakenings, your tent revivals, but also the birth of movements like New Thought, which was huge from about the 1860s onward, which was this sort of the secret self-help movement, where basically if you think about it hard enough, it will happen. Which became a hugely influential and sort of led to a whole publishing industry of various self-help books of that ilk. There's spiritualism and the rise of sort of obsessions with Ouija boards and contacting the dead that became really ubiquitous on the East Coast. But there's also, I'd argue, various evangelical revivals well within the Christian tradition, where the narrative was often something like, the church has become, or Christianity has become, desiccated. Nobody really believes anymore. People just go through the motions. You just go to church on Sunday and it doesn't really matter. We need to look for a personal relationship with God. We need to look for something more intense, more intimate. And of course, the sort of various countercultural religions and syncretic religions of the 1960s. So that is absolutely not new. If anything, I'd argue it's just a pendulum swing back and forth forever, however many hundred years. But where I think something is distinct and new about this Great Awakening is the internet, fitting, as you say, given that we are trying to gather in this way at this time. I like to say that what the Protestant Reformation, or what the printing press rather was to the Protestant Reformation, sort of the creation of a model of consuming information that was in many ways intimate and inward. You were reading a book, you had your sort of direct connection to the text to sort of internalize in such a way, and one may well sort of draw that connection to the Protestant ethos overall. I'd argue we're seeing kind of these new religions being the religions of the internet age, where we are all not just consumers of content, we are not just readers, but we are also inclined to culturally think of ourselves as creators, to think of ourselves as people who have or want to have ownership over stories. And in some ways, of course, this sort of harkens back to various oral traditions as well, but with the added sort of dizzying disembodiment of the internet itself, where I think that this hunger to create, to be involved, to have ownership in our stories has made us all the more resistant to perhaps orthodox ways or traditionally orthodox ways of experiencing, receiving dogma and doctrine. I think as well, our particular capitalist moment, so in the era of personal branding, made us cognizant of a model of our identities based so heavily on our choices, what news we consume, what papers we read, what music we listen to, what movies we watch, what we post, what we tweet, all create this kind of odd public-private synthesis of identity. And I think within that culture, there's a sort of odd consumerist strain of, you know, what app am I using to meditate? What purchases am I making? Am I going to a soul cycle class? Am I getting a sweet green salad? I think wellness culture is perhaps the biggest, most obvious example of this. But I think that the way in which our conspicuous and perhaps less conspicuous consumption is seen to define us, especially in the age of the algorithm, where our recommendations are getting narrower and narrower, it contributes to this kind of hyper atomized individualization.
So I want to press you a little bit on the point you made at the end, right? Because I think this is one of the interesting things about the book, is that it sort of at the core, you're talking about practices and sort of experiments that are agree fit some kind of definition of religious or spiritual, right? I mean, I think the core of the book is about, in certain ways, the revival of pagan, pantheist, occultist practices in various forms in American life. But then your definition of sort of new religion spreads outward and encompasses, as you were just saying, sort of consumer culture or sort of personalized aspects of consumer culture, sort of zone, everything sort of holistic and personalized wellness culture and so on. So convince me, as someone maybe a little inclined to skepticism of that, that it makes sense to fit the world of brands and sort of that kind of self-cultivation under the umbrella of religion or religious practice.
Sure. So I'd argue that there's a sort of implicit theology that's shared by so many of these movements, particularly something sort of very consumer-based, like the wellness movement I talk about. And that's this sort of implicit theology of what I'll just call like best selfism. The idea that it is a moral, a spiritual demand to be your best self, to improve in a certain way that is, I'd argue, rather solipsistic. It's kind of the collapse of this distinction between the effort you put on a soul cycle bike, the purity you get from having the right green juice with the minimal amount of toxins, the sort of way that your skin looks after your 10-step beauty routine. The way in which these things are sold and talked about is so loaded with this language of self-care, not just as a kind of a nice thing to do, although of course historically the word self-care does rather come from a much more political place, but in this sort of wellness paradigm in which it's now found itself. There's a sense in which if we are not taking care of ourselves, if we are not putting in the effort to be the best in this certain way, which is of course also quite rooted in, happens to make us prettier or ostensibly prettier and ostensibly more fit and ostensibly have a dewy complexion or what have you. That there is a kind of purity that we're reaching in so doing. And I'd argue that there's sort of elements of that are taken from, for example, New Thought. There's elements of that are taken from the prosperity gospel tradition, which is sort of adjacent to that. But I think that the idea that more broadly, your job as a human being on this earth is to be your truest self, to be your best self, also to be your most authentic self, to release yourself from repression, from ways that society has acted upon you, and kind of figure out who you really are, is I'd argue, coded as a moral, a spiritual good. There is, the language of energy is really popular in wellness circles. It's popular certainly in various occult, broadly conceived circles. And I think that there are versions of that of course are much more political and much more outward looking and focus much more on solidarity. But the sort of capitalist version of it, the branded version of it, does tend to equate personal fulfillment with a kind of vibration on the right frequency of the right energy in a way that I find incredibly interesting and quite revealing.
So is Goop a church?
Yes, I would say so. That said, what Goop doesn't have, and I think this is because it is a brand from which we buy things and doesn't have the community aspect the way SoulCycle.
I do all my shopping at Goop. I should emphasize. So.
Well,
and it shows. I'm my best self right here. Sorry, go on, Tara.
Oh, no, just that I think that SoulCycle is an even better example because it combines, I think, a lot of the Goop-esque metaphysic and the aesthetic and the kind of sense of purpose with a community and a ritual that let you experience that in the moment. I remember I went through a few SoulCycle classes. I wish I could say they were all for research. They were not. But there's these signs as you go in, and first of all, like, we're a community, we're a soul, we're a tribe, we're a pack, we're a cult. It says it right there. And then all of the signs say things like, your energy affects your neighbor's energy. So like, please don't do this, that, or the other thing, in a way that is, again, using this kind of vague, somewhat nebulous, spiritualized language to talk about, or to lend to what could just be like an uncomfortable fitness class to burn some calories into something with an aura of spiritual attainment. What you're doing isn't just good for you, it's good for the universe and your role in it.
So one thing that has struck me that I think fits with your argument about the difference between the early 21st century and its gurus and the 19th century and its gurus is just, it's an absence of institutionalization, right? Mm-hmm. That the United States has a lot of the same kind of spiritual entrepreneurs and would-be gurus that we had in the Victorian era or the early 19th century, but they don't, or at least they don't seem as likely to found things that we call churches, right? So we just had Marianne Williamson in the presidential campaign, right? And Marianne Williamson, I think, she's a pre-internet figure originally. She rises to prominence in the 1980s, but she's sort of a paradigmatic, like updated new thought kind of figure. And I feel like in the 19th century, there would be a church founded by Marianne Williamson, right? And, it wouldn't be huge, but it would have like, 200,000 people, and, it would be like the Swedenborgians or something. And there would be sort of chapels around the country. And that doesn't seem to happen to anything like the same extent, especially over the last couple of generations. You have a little bit, a little stuff in the 70s and 80s, but especially lately. And do you think how much of that is the internet? How much of that is just sort of an ambient skepticism of institutions? Why doesn't Gwyneth Paltrow have, I guess Kanye West has Sunday services, right? Why isn't there a Sunday service for Goop?
I'm not sure that it would not be successful, at least initially. I think that I think the label of church, or the label of kind of making something a church, is, I think, as you say, would be met with a degree of suspicion. I think as well, the sort of fact that there is such a willingness to mix and match, that we millennials, the broader we here, are me personally, yes, are so much of the contemporary religious landscape, I'd argue, is about that kind of precise individualization, so that in the end, we can't necessarily get away from the endpoint being that we are all the high priests of our own church, that we don't have, and I think this is true much more broadly, trust not only in our religious institutions, but in our civic ones, and our political ones, in our journalistic and media institutions as well, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know. But I think that there is, I think that suspicion does just lend itself to such a focus on the self. And I want to be careful here, because I think that there's an easy narrative that we could go to that says, oh, kids these days with their selfies, they're so narcissistic, all being priests in their own religion. And I think that's a tempting way that one could go about reading the situation. But I actually think that what we're seeing isn't necessarily a story of solipsism or of narcissism, but of institutional failure. I think that it is perfectly reasonable, and in fact completely understandable, that if your institutions have failed you, if you don't think you can trust the media, the scientific establishment, the political system, the academic system, so on and so forth, it makes perfect sense to turn inward, to rely on yourself, to rely on your own gut instincts and desires and affinities and feelings as authoritative, because at least you know that you're not, well, you might be lying to yourself in a sort of broader theological way, but at least you might have slightly more trust that you're aware of yourself than you are of other people.
So I guess to push on that point a tiny bit, is this sustainable? Right? Because this is a book about our whole culture, but it is obviously focused on, I guess you could say, people younger than me. I just turned 40. So millennials and Generation Z. And these are people who are sort of conducting experiments in religion at a time that they're conducting experiments, in relationships and professional experiments and so on. And I think you can tell a plausible story where, these are the children of baby boomers who had their own rebellion and often sort of hung on to an institutional affiliation. And obviously you talk a little bit about this kind of person in the book, the generational turnover, where they took one step out the door of their institutions, but kept one foot in the door, and then their kids have taken the other step. But their kids haven't, for the most part, gone through the 50 to 60 years of life that awaits after your 20s, right? In which the forms, not necessarily the dogma or doctrine of religion, but the sort of communal forms of religion, the sort of solidarity of a religious institution or community that it's not clear that Goop or even Soul Cycle provides, the role that a bar mitzvah or a first communion plays, and so on. So obviously this is more in like the prophecy line, but what does this look like in 25 years for the people conducting these experiments now?
So I think you're absolutely right that sort of the more let's say inward looking, the sort of nihilism of Soul Cycle that is so not just self-focused but present, those are the things that I think are unsustainable. I think that we will see a hunger for collectivity, a hunger for solidarity, that the kind of pure sort of self-interested versions of these new religions, the wellness cultures of the world, can't offer. I think that what we will see, and I'm sort of interested in particular in, for example, sort of social justice as a movement, in part because what it does offer is an ideology of community, an ideology of solidarity, which I think is there is a real hunger for. And the way that I'm interested too, more broadly, and I talk about this in a chapter on polyamory and on kind of the free love as a continuation of ideas of human perfectionism in the 19th century, but ways in which, and this is a term sort of that's long been used in the queer community, but chosen family. And where people who are or marginalized by or experience marginalization from traditional religious institutions, people who for whatever reason are alienated from traditional religious institutions or indeed civic institutions, whose family of origin might not be in touch with in the same way, might be able to find one another. I think that there's a hopefulness in the idea that as a result of the kind of tribalization you find on the internet, where people can find like-minded people, where people can find communities, there are options for solidarity, for coming together, for the creation of ritual in a way that may not look like organized religion as perhaps traditionally practiced, but nevertheless offer that sense of community. I always remember there's a woman I interviewed before starting the book. It was my last piece for Vox, who lost her husband unexpectedly, quite young, and wanted with his friends to celebrate and commemorate his life in a way that was specific to him. And so the friends got together and they played music from his favorite video game. There was a sort of service that was very much designed not around religious lines or traditional religious lines, but rather among who this person was, what his life was like. And she ended up, he'd wanted to play a sequel to a video game they played together. He wasn't able to do that. And she kind of, with people that she met online through this game, played this game sort of in his memory. And this was, she reported, hugely important to her. And I think that's such a telling example of how these communal bonds and our desire for these communal bonds can survive the sort of reshaping, even as I think the sort of perhaps pure selfish inwardness of, I'm being really mean about Soul Cycle on this call. I hope they don't hate me. But the inwardness of a certain kind of wellness culture, shall we say, I think is unsustainable.
So let's drill down then on the question of belief, right? So we're talking about community, but the core of what we think of as religion has always been belief, and that there's a lot of sociological debate about how important are actual creedal statements, and don't people really take their religious identity from community rather than from creeds. And I think there's truth to that, but it's also true that the major world religions have been structured around actual metaphysical claims about the universe. And one question that we've had these conversations before, and I always ask you this question, but I'll ask it again, because I think it sort of radiates through a lot of the more sort of supernaturally oriented experiments that you're writing about, which is, how much do people really believe in what they're doing? And specifically when you're talking about sort of neo-paganism, the occult, people who are sort of reaching back or reinventing pre-Christian or non-Christian traditions. They're invoking gods, they're invoking demons, they're doing witchcraft. Some of it seems like play, some of it seems like experiment, some of it seems to have real belief. How do you see the question of belief playing out there?
I think that, as you say, belief is very difficult to quantify. I mean, it's certainly difficult to disentangle from any of these other practices. And I think, as you say, and as I argue in the book, that they always say there's as many definitions of religion as there are scholars of religion, and certainly there are definitions that would say it doesn't matter at all, it's just about the community. There's definitions that say, are there metaphysical truth claims, yes or no? But I think that the truth is something a little bit more complicated, which is that if you affirm something to be true and you act as if it were true, or you act in accordance with the sort of the values that you create and espouse, you kind of reaffirm the truth of that within a community, such that there's a sort of a social reality that is something a little bit more complex, and I would argue inward than, for a model where like everyone's doing something and no one believes it, but they're all just sort of pretending to get along, which I think is the sort of straw man version of what a community model would look like. I always think of, Ignatius of Loyola, practice the acts of faith and the faith will come. I think that ritual and community can indeed be a precursor to faith or to a spiritual awareness, rather than simply being kind of an either or saying belief has to precede ritual and community.
So, I mean, and then to sort of take that, there's also then the ways that these things sort of feed back into political life, right? And I mean, I think one of the more interesting aspects of the sort of neo-pagan thing that's happened in American culture is that it seems to have sort of left-wing and right-wing manifestations, right? And so you have chapters in the book that sort of follow what we might call pagan threads to very different political and cultural destinations. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the first of and perhaps the most prominent example of neo-pagan paganism, conceived of broadly. Again, the terms are a bit fluid here. There's the religion of Wicca itself. There's people who self-identify as Wiccan but might not belong to a coven, et cetera, et cetera. But the sort of rough umbrella of progressive witchcraft or progressive witch culture is, I think, a hugely significant phenomenon. So already in 2014, when Alex Marr wrote a book called Witches of America, she identified about 1 million self-identified witches in the country and said at the time it was the fastest growing religious tradition. That was before 2016, which is, I'd argue, where it all changed. So I think in the wake of Donald Trump's election, in the wake of the Women's March in particular, and the sort of feminist movement around that, there was a real interest on the part of spiritually interested progressives, young progressives, particularly young women, also queer people, who found within the imagery of witchcraft and the sort of conscious transgression of the nasty woman, the sort of difficult woman, the woman who is sexually in charge of her own sexuality, found these images kind of liberating, in part because they were so coded as in opposition to the white evangelical Trump GOP alliance. And so you'd have sort of witches hexing Trump, or later witches hexing Kavanaugh, as these kind of mass cathartic, symbolic, but also, I'd argue, sort of spiritually real outpourings of anger, of grief. And I'd say when I say spiritually real, I think that it would be fair to say that it was a symbol set, that a language that people were able to use to process their anger, but also their sort of hope for a different world, rather than it just being like a convenient symbol set. But then, as you say, sort of going completely across the political spectrum, there's also the rise of what I call a certain kind of atavism, the sort of reactionary desire for, and you find this in fans of Jordan Peterson on the one hand, members of men's rights groups on the Reddit subforum, the Red Pill on the other, the alt-right more generally, this kind of quasi-Nietzschean or like neo-watered down, hyped up Nietzscheanism of let's return to the good old days when sort of a hybrid of ancient Greece as seen through Hercules' The Legendary Journeys and the 1950s as seen through Pleasantville, of the good old days when men were men and women were women, and we all had our place, and this kind of obsession with physical strength, with a kind of primordial truth of the blood, and there's a sort of implicit blood and soil here that I'll just let hang in the air. But I think that this kind of reactionary atavism, which is itself a response, codes itself as a response to the desiccated modern world and the corrupt modern world and the civilization which feminism and PC culture have destroyed, was as the narrative goes, is a kind of desire to reclaim an imagined primal past. And there's often a kind of very strong interest in slightly dubious evo-psych and what nature says goes. I kind of would call it a kind of nature worship. So that's a very different form of paganism that takes very different things from our pagan past, shall we say.
And so do you, just just in listening to you describe it and the figures that you reference, it seems to be, in part that you can see that as a kind of sex and gender polarization, right, in religion, where obviously there are male witches and, male pagans on the pagan left, and there are, I guess, trad wife, alt-right, neo-pagan women, but there does seem to be a sense in which, the sort of larger polarization of the sexes in our culture, which is manifest in politics and other areas, seems to play out a little bit in this religious landscape, right? And you could do it, you could sort of come closer to the center and say, well, it's Oprah Winfrey and Joel Osteen are sort of the yin and yang of the American religious center, and then the yin and yang of the American religious extremes are, the witches hexing Kavanaugh and Bronze Age pervert supporting Donald Trump or something, right? That there's sort of but that this in certain ways reflects a kind of religious failure, in the sense that you would expect a successful religious community to sort of socialize men and women together in certain ways, which maybe is not happening. What do you think of that?
So I'd say it's a much broader failure than just religious. I mean, when I look at sort of the wide range of these groups, and I don't think they're exactly comparable. I certainly have quite a lot more condemnation for the atavists than I do for the witches. That said, I think that what we're seeing and what I find so fascinating is that so many of the subjects of their ire, other than of course one another, are the same. Are certain newspapers, for example, horrible PC feminist bastions of the horrible woke age, or are they these sort of white supremacist patriarchal papers, and I'm not naming names, that should be struck down because that they failed in that way? And these are in often sort of both charges that are leveled against institutions more broadly. And I think that whatever else we want to say, it's that our civic institutions have failed us more broadly, that there is some, I'm not any paper in particular, but sort of speaking more broadly, I think that there is a sense in which not the center, but the institutions that make up our lives have lost our trust. And however we may understand or give voice to those failings, there is, I would argue, a something interesting to me in how widespread the distrust is of kind of institutional targets.
So I'd like to thank everyone who has followed my instructions and actually asked some questions. So we've got about 15 or 20 minutes now, and I'm going to take some questions out of the queue, maybe adapt them slightly using the moderator's prerogative. But we'll start with a question from Avi. He cites the Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor, the Canadian author of A Secular Age, the largest book that you can possibly buy and maybe possibly read. And Avi says, that Taylor suggests that some version of what you're describing is inevitable if we get the history of the last 500 years right, since religion has been decoupled from the state in North Atlantic societies, but humans are still on a quest to find fullness and meaning, which can only be understood in religious terms. And so Taylor calls this a kind of nova effect, an explosion of religious options. And he defends this pluralism against charges that it's too individualistic or too narcissistic and so on. And so that I think that dovetails, the Avi's point dovetails with some of what you've been saying. I want to take it though and link it to some of, we briefly mentioned sort of the social justice movements and, Black Lives Matters and the sort of protest politics that are sort of dominating discussion right now. One thing that struck me about those protests is it seems like there's the nova effect and sort of the desire for individualism, but then there's also still a desire for a kind of religious unity, right? Like it's sort of striking to see, and some of it is corporate bullshit, right? But sort of the sense that like we want to live in a society where every institution, high and low, corporate and governmental and so on, is on board with this cause, that seems almost to push against the Nova effect and the idea that it's all just going to be individualism, that there is some desire to have a sort of unified church of social justice. Do you see that?
Yes, absolutely. And if anything, I think that's one of the reasons that, and again, speaking somewhat reductively as we have to do in this conversation, but the social justice movement, I think is so works so well and is so powerful and is so effective, is in part because it sort of, on the one hand, insofar as it is, its current version is a version of our times. Of course, it is sort of rooted in a degree of intuitionalism, a degree of inwardness, but it also offers that vision of solidarity, of unity, and of a common good that can be shared, of a better world. And I think that there is something vital in, I would say, there is a hunger for something vital that I see more broadly, which is a sense that our institutions shouldn't just sort of work in a sort of functional way. They should be for something good. And I think it's often the case that when I've read sort of the social justice culture as a religion, there's a version of that I read a lot that is quite, is basically using that as pejoratively. It's saying, oh, it's a cult, or they're zealots, or so on and so forth. I think a better way of framing that is, I mean, yes, it works because it is a religion. It works because it can harness a real sense of meaning, of purpose, of community and ritual that actually points beyond the self. It gives us, an eschatology that sort of other iterations of more purely intuitionalist, or let's say both intuitionalist, that's hard to say, and self-focused religious phenomena don't. And I do want to draw a distinction here between, I suppose, the social justice movement as a kind of organic phenomenon and its sort of corporatization, as indeed pretty much everything that one could think of gets sort of assumed by corporations to sell products. And so I sort of do want to I think I want to draw the distinction between kind of a movement in and of itself and the way in which it kind of gets fed through the shredder of, and now, certain brands that are going to say the right thing at the right time and post the right Instagram, like was it Kendall Jenner's Pepsi, Black Lives Matter Pepsi ad in 2017, and that's sort of its own thing.
But isn't that sort of how a religion wins, right? I mean, if you go back to the 4th century Roman world, right? You had sort of the zealots of Christianity, and then you had the, Roman aristocrats, who sort of the equivalent of brands, I guess, today, who didn't really care one way or another about the doctrine of the Trinity, but decided, well, this is the company, I'm going to endow a church over here. I'm going to sort of act the Christian part. I mean, that it seems to me that kind of sort of corporate virtue signaling is itself inseparable from, in certain ways, the ascent and triumph of a new worldview.
That's certainly fair, and I think that there is that is certainly one path, let's say, to victory is through this kind of corporatization. I can't help but wonder, though, whether another path might actually be through politics, I mean, I, like many others, was rather excited about the Bernie Sanders campaign. So this was probably something I might have wondered about with slightly more hope a few months ago than now. But I do wonder whether, these religious nuns, and particularly these progressive nuns, they do vote. And they're actually, I think, in 20 states, I want to say, they're the single biggest religious demographic. And if we think about, for example, white evangelicals, who are the only sort of bloc that turned out consistently for Trump with 81%, as sort of everyone knows that statistic now, that's always bandied about. They're 13-14% of the population. They vote in an outsized way. Their turnout's always great, but they're 13% of the population and declining. When we're talking about the religious nuns, and sure, that's a bigger group than sort of social justice progressives more broadly, although of course there's a lot of crossover. We're talking about 23% of Americans. We're talking about 36% of young Americans. And so I do wonder if One way in which this might kind of make its way into the culture is through the ballot box, whether we might at some point see a political experiment that takes these values and puts them into practice and sees how they work. And I'd certainly be curious.
So this was actually one of our questions from Jan Havi, asking, how do you think these new religions will sort and affect our current two parties? And you sort of gesture at this. Let me suggest the sort of darker scenario, right, which is that to the extent that one of our political coalitions becomes sort of defined by and dominated by some version of these new religions, and our other political coalition is still defined by and dominated by whatever remains of institutional Christianity, that creates a much bigger religious political divide than America has had in the past. I mean, even, our Civil War was essentially a intra-Christian theological conflict with people, having huge arguments, but they were still arguing about the interpretation of the same Bible, right? So this, I mean, the vision you've just set up does seem to set up a version of the culture war that would, in certain ways, could be even more profound and divisive, than the one we've had for the last 30 or 40 years as Christianity has slowly retreated.
I mean, I think that's right. I think that's certainly, one could certainly say a danger, but I think another way to look at it is, we are in a kind of vacuum moment. Something you brought up earlier, Ross, and I sort of want to reiterate it, is that this isn't just sort of a purely new phenomenon so much as it's sort of the tail end of a multi-generational phenomenon. We talked about sort of, as you said, the boomers with one foot out the door in terms of a kind of disillusionment with in this case, religious, organized religion, but also sort of more broadly a certain way of doing things. And I think that, I just a sidebar here, I think most people who leave religious tradition actually do so. One of the biggest predictors and indicators is how much religion is spoken of in the home. So you do have, your tail end of your nuns who are leaving the faith are doing so in part kind of having witnessed a certain apathy in their own parents. And so, yes, I think that there is a sort of bleakness or potential bleakness to this coming vacuum, but I'd also argue it's been a long time coming.
So we have a question from Maxine that sort of drills down at what you were just talking about, which is, did you find that there was any really specific patterns in the religious background of people who were involved in these new movements beyond just their religion in the home tended to be more attenuated? Were they more likely to be lapsed evangelicals, lapsed Catholics, mainline versus evangelical, and so on? I mean,
yeah. So the mainlines churches have emptied faster than evangelical churches, particularly white evangelical churches. And just as a sort of side note, historically Black churches and white evangelical churches are usually in polling data looked at differently, which is why I'm making that distinction. But at the same time, at this point, the nuns come from everywhere. At this point, there aren't actually, they're relatively reflective of the United States as a whole, a little whiter, but not by much. There's only one actually very big predictor, and that is that 46% of queer people, rather than, again, 24% of the national average, are religiously unaffiliated. So that's one of the only kind of really big, notable, and perhaps expected, given how many queer people have been marginalized in traditional religious institutions. That's kind of the big one.
Is there any big gender breakdown, just men versus women?
I want to say there's slightly more women are unaffiliated overall. Slightly more men are likely to say that they're full-on atheists or agnostic. But again, these are pretty slight.
And they wear fedoras. And... all right. Well, we've got about 6 minutes left, so let me try and squeeze in a couple more questions. One question someone brings up, I guess, when I had mentioned sort of religious coming of age ceremonies, the idea that colleges and sort of college admissions and graduation sort of fill that role. And one thing we haven't talked about is the Harry Potter phenomenon, And so maybe this would be a chance to talk about sort of the peculiar role that sort of the school plays in a certain kind of quasi-religious event, like the idea of sort of, anyway, talk for 3 minutes about Harry
Potter. All right, go.
Go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is true that is sort of a remnant of, there are sort of civil institutions that still have a kind of cultural cachet. But about Harry Potter specifically, especially over the past week, as J.K. Rowling has, let's say, alienated quite a big percentage of her fan base, I find it's so fascinating that Harry Potter's been a kind of canary in the coal mine for so much of these cultural shifts since its publication. So between 1997, when the first book was published, and 2000, when the fourth book was published, at-home internet in America increased from 19 million households to 100 million. So 500%, more than 500% increase. And that dovetailed, so that sort of version of fandom and the way in which fan culture kind of developed around it dovetailed so completely with the kind of the rise of a very particular internet culture, one that was about sort of, whether it's fan fiction or creation or memes, but the idea that you could have ownership of your texts. You could have ownership of the things that you loved. This was not a model where someone kind of came down from on high, the powers that be, as showrunners were wont to be called in fandom, had the final word on what a property was. And we certainly see that in our relationship to media now, the amount of shows that are sort of fan service or designed for the fans, and there being a much bigger back and forth between consumers of information and creators of information. And I think that it reaches sort of this fascinating zenith in the idea that J.K. Rowling is, exiled from her creation because it's not seen as hers, it's seen as everyone's. There's often the response to Rowling has not been, let's never read Harry Potter again. It's, well, Hogwarts is bigger than she is. We can still write fiction in this community. We can still love these characters. They belong to us. And I think that tendency kind of writ large can tell us so much about the wider questions of intuitionalism, institutionalism, inwardness, and individualization that we're seeing writ large in the book.
So last question. Let's do a post-COVID world question, right? One person says, do you think in a post-COVID world where people will be looking to find meaning and purpose and community, that these sort of newer, stranger faiths will be fast-tracked? And do you think that there is a sense in which they could be more likely to sort of form actual communities, or even cults, which is a word we haven't used that much, in the way, like, this is one way to put it, is we're seeing this as sort of a 1968 moment in our politics right now. Well, the 1970s were sort of the high tide of weird communal experiments, strange religious cults. What do you foresee after COVID and maybe after Donald Trump?
Well, I think the combination of our increased ability to and awareness of the ability to gather remotely with a kind of increased awareness of our reliance on one another, of our need for social bonds and the kind of loneliness of pure atomization. And I think the quarantine experience is simultaneously both. We're able to interact with one another online, and yet we are in our own houses, if we are privileged enough to be able to be. And that kind of loneliness is itself, I think, may lend to an increased hunger. So absolutely, I think that we will see people gathering digitally, and perhaps not when we're able to not, but I think people will be much more interested in forming intentional community, especially if we get to the point of thinking about our pods. Who are our bubbles? Who are our safe chosen family? I wonder if that tendency will sort of lend itself out toward a form of intentional community, and maybe even a disembodied form of intentional community. I'm curious what that might look like.
But do you think it's also possible that there could be, I mean, look, this has been fantastic, but it's really not the same as doing a panel in the flesh, right? And that goes double and triple, I think, for a lot of religious practices. So could there be a sort of anti-internet religion backlash that sort of manifests itself in a desire for infleshed communities, or communes with large vegetable gardens and weird polyamorous living arrangements?
I mean, some of those things do sound very tempting. I really would personally like a vegetable garden right about now. But I mean, I think that that's certainly possible. I think that, however, I think that it may be that even if these communities do come about in the flesh ultimately, it may well be that we will use the internet to get there. We will find one another online the same way, 40% of Americans find their partner online. That doesn't mean they never meet in real life, or maybe it will under COVID, but has not thus far ended up that way. So I think that the digital space and the promise of that will be a sort of launching pad for people to seek out and find communities that may then manifest themselves as corporeal chosen families.
All right, Tara, it's 8 o'clock. So I want to apologize to everyone who asked questions that we didn't get to. You were terrific, and there are many even more wonderful questions further down the queue. And thank you all for joining us. Again, to repeat what I said at the outset, I hope that if you found this an illuminating and interesting experience, that you will buy Tara's book, buy many other books, support the Strand, support your local bookstore. And as my final word, since I didn't say anything in my capacity as a practitioner of one of the ancient institutional faiths, as a Roman Catholic, while you're dabbling in the strange new rites that Tara describes, stay safe out there. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.